want to talk about two things tonight, but they actually relate to one subject, and I want to begin the lesson in kind of a general way and then expand into two things. You know, in our world, there's a little three-word phrase that's pretty common in almost any area of any product that you might imagine, and that would be the words new and improved. And you see that pretty constantly. And sometimes I wonder if there's been any significant change in the product, or it's just simply that the product's been around so many years that finally they decide everybody's kind of taking it for granted, so just write new and improved on it so that it'll kind of catch their attention. Because everybody kind of wants that which is the newest and the most improved. But the question I have to ask this evening is about God. Does God's work need improvement? Now, we've been talking on Sunday morning in 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, and 3 about the wisdom of God as opposed to the wisdom of man, about fleshly wisdom and spiritual wisdom and the contrast between them. And we've talked over and over and over about the limited knowledge of man and God's wisdom certainly being superior to his. And we've talked about that repeatedly on and on and on. But I want to ask the question because I hear two statements made by people pretty regularly that really suggest that there are people in this world who believe that what God has given us can be improved, that we can improve it, that we can make it better by altering it in some way. I want to begin the lesson by going back to Deuteronomy chapter 27, and I'll read the first 8 verses here. This is an interesting situation. The people of Israel are crossing over the Jordan River into the land of Caney, are about to. They are not at this time, but they're about to. Moses, of course, wasn't able to make that journey. Joshua led them in that journey. Moses died before they crossed over the river. But at any rate, Moses is talking about the day that they crossed the river and something they should do. And what he says is really interesting to notice. And the inference of it, that which is inferred in it, is pretty strong. Moses with the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I commanded you this day. And it shall be on the day when you shall pass over Jordan into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, that thou shalt set thee up great stones, and plaster them with plaster. And shall write upon them all the words of this law, when thou art passed over it, that thou mayest go in into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, a land that floweth with milk and honey, as the Lord God of thy fathers has promised. Therefore it shall be, when you be gone over Jordan, that you shall set up these stones which I command you this day in Mount Ebal, and thou shalt plaster them with plaster. And there shalt thou build an altar unto the Lord thy God, an altar of stones. Thou shalt not lift up any iron tool upon them. Thou shalt build the altar of the Lord thy God of whole stones, and thou shalt offer burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt offer peace offerings, and shalt eat there, and rejoice before the Lord thy God. And thou shalt write upon the stones all the words of his law very plainly. It's really interesting in verse 5 that he says, thou shalt not lift up any iron tool upon them. Now, you're just supposed to pick up stones. We actually learned later they actually picked those stones up as they crossed over the river Jordan, out of the river itself, and then carried them and used them and stacked them up and made the altar. But the interesting thing is how that he did not want them altered in any way. You know, if you stop and think, and you look at the most amazing things that you've ever seen, at least in my case, the most amazing things that I've ever seen are things that man had nothing to do with, that God created. Now, man's done some pretty incredible things, but if you look at the things that God has created, they certainly far outstrip and outweigh that which man has been able to do. And so Moses wants to make the people, in this instance, understand that I'm not asking something here that exhibits how great you are. I'm not asking for something here that exhibits how knowledgeable you are, how talented you are. I'm simply asking something here that will simply be used in worship to God, but that you have very little to do with. And that it's not something that you ought. It's kind of interesting to think about that. That these stones were not embellished with their talent and their wisdom. They were just plain, simple stones. Now, if you stop and you think about that, you realize that there is significance to that. You know, most of the time when you look at very wise people and they say things, and you're sitting there, you're trying to say, well, what's he trying to do? Because you can't really figure it out because you're not quite up to his level of intelligence, perhaps, and you can't read his mind. But sometimes those people have something in mind by that. They want to teach you a lesson. And you just can't help but believe that God is saying this to these people by the words that he used, that there will be an altar of stones, not to lift any iron tool upon them. Don't do anything. Just bring them and set them up exactly as I created them. That he's trying to make a point, that this altar is not something that's a part of your alter ego. It's a part of an altar to worship God upon. And that it's not something that you're going to build and you're going to make it beautiful by your own talent and your own wisdom. I think God wanted them to realize that the person that was going to be pleased with this was not them. And I have a feeling, have you ever seen a fireplace that's made like that? I've seen a few. We had a neighbor in New Johnsonville, and they bought some land in the country. And he went out there and built a fireplace out of stone. And I believe it might quite well have been the ugliest thing I've ever seen, because he didn't really arrange anything. He didn't cut anything, didn't trim anything. He just kind of threw mud on them and piled them all up there. And when I look at that, I think, boy, that really is ugly. But here's the problem. Who was he trying to please? Me or him? Well, it pleased him. He liked it. So what difference did it make? When God looks at this and this altar, who has to be pleased with it? The people? Or, if somebody came up and said, it doesn't look very good. Maybe you should have taken a little time to cut those stones, make them fit together better. Who's pleased with that? Who are you pleasing? You're not pleasing people. It's God you're offering offerings to. It's God that the altar has been built under the direction of, and therefore you're pleasing him. Now, I want to use that a little bit and jump off into something. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10. In Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10, there's this famous passage that talks about the church and how it's part of God's eternal purpose. But that's not what we're emphasizing at the present. What we're emphasizing at the present is something stated in verse 10. To the intent that now under the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. Now, that's not saying that the church is to be the one that teaches the truth, although that's stated in another place. In this particular case, the language is indicating that the church, like that altar of whole stones, stands as an emblem of God's wisdom. It is an emblem of God's wisdom. It was built to reflect his wisdom. And therefore, it was built for the express purpose and designed for the express purpose of glorifying him. And everybody has to kind of understand that and to realize that. But when you continue to think about that, there's a passage that we've studied so many times back in the book of 2 Kings. And I can't help but read it, and I can't help but think about it, because it may be the best example of what we're trying to say that exists in the inspired text. And I thought about trying to cut it down and to read fewer verses. But the more I looked at it, I didn't think that would be in the best interest of the point we're trying to make, because you have to read it all to be able to comprehend the lesson that's being taught. You're talking about Naaman. He was the captain of the host of the king of Syria. He was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance into Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, talking about Elisha, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus saith the maid that is in the land of Israel, is of the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go to now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he departed, and took with him 10 talents of silver, and 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therefore sent Naaman, my servant, to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. Now, can you imagine when a king gets a letter from a foreign king that says, I have a servant who has leprosy, and I'm sending you this letter, and I want you to cure it. Now, you're talking about a king who had no interest in God, no interest in serving God, no real faith in God. This is a king who reigned over a country that had built 2 calves to keep people from going to the temple to worship God. So he certainly didn't have that kind of appreciation. And you know what his meaning, what his thought was. You don't have to read his mind. You're told what his thought was. When the king had read the letter, he rent his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive? That this man does send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. He thought the letter was a trick. That was an impossible thing to do. And consequently, that all the king of Syria was trying to do was to stir back up the war that existed between them. That's what he thought. But that wasn't true. And it was so when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him now come to me, and he shall know that is there a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses, with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. Now remember, this is a great and powerful man. This would be kind of the equivalent of, I guess the best known leader of our military forces in recent years has been Colin Powell, one that gained the most notoriety, that everyone knows his name more than anyone else. It'd be kind of like him coming to your house and driving up and making a request of you, and then you offer this response to him. Elisha just sent a messenger unto him. Didn't come out of the house. Can you imagine if a person of that stature and that importance had driven his car up to your door and was sitting there and sent someone in and basically telling you, come out, and you don't even go. You just send somebody out to tell him what you got to say. And what he said didn't make him any happier. He said, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. That's not a hard thing to do. It's not a difficult thing to understand. He knew where the Jordan River was. He could count to 7. And he knew what it meant to dip yourself in a river. None of that was difficult. None of it was hard. But Naaman was not happy. He was angry, and he went away. He said, Behold, I thought, he surely will come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper, like some of the so-called faith healers on television, making a big production, getting your handlers, get everybody out there, get everything set up, and then all of a sudden strike somebody in the head and say whatever it is that you're going to say to heal them. That's what he thought was going to happen. He wanted a spectacle, a public spectacle to be made. But it didn't happen. He went on to say, now think about it. The question that we're suggesting is, can you improve on God's plan? He goes to the prophet of God. The prophet of God gives him information that God has revealed to him as to how to receive this miracle. He said, I think I can improve on this. I look at 2 rivers where I came from, Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus. Better than all the waters of Israel. The only waters in Israel basically is the Jordan. about it. A few creeks. Jordan River is not very impressive. Everyone who's been there tells me it's about like the creek behind the church building. And it's not a very pretty place. It's not a mighty river like we would think of some of the ones in our country. It was just kind of a nothing type of a river, I guess. And this guy said, you know what? I've got so many better. May I not wash in them and be clean? I want to improve on this plan. This is not a good plan. Jordan River's just not much. And I think that I can improve on it and I can make it better. And he turned away and went away in a rage. And his servants came near, spake unto him, and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, would thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean? He thought about it. He went down. He dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Now ask yourself a few questions. Suppose that he had forced Elisha out of the house and held a sword to his head and said, if you don't strike me and demand that I be healed, then I'm going to kill you. And suppose that Elisha had submitted to that and had actually struck him and said, be healed. Would he have been healed? The answer is no. Suppose he went back home and he went to those 2 rivers that he mentioned, maybe to both of them. And he dipped 7 times in those rivers. Would he have been healed? And the answer to that question is no. So I ask you the question, could he have improved upon God's plan? Well, the answer is no. The answer is no. He could not have improved upon God's plan. God tried to teach a lesson to the people of Israel. You know what? I'm the one in charge here. You're not. I'm the one who makes the rules. You don't. I'm the one who makes things work, and you don't. And he tells this man basically something to do that teaches exactly the same lesson. So in the end, when he was cleansed, what did it demonstrate? It was a testimony to the wisdom of God, wasn't it? Just like the church is a testimony to the wisdom of God. God made it one. He gave us the instructions. If we follow them, it will be glorifying Him, just like this man was cleansed. If we don't follow them, there's no benefit from it, period. We can't improve it. We can't. It is as perfect as God is perfect. Now, there are 2 questions that come to mind. One of them is the autonomy of the church. And the reason I bring this up is because this is one that I've been questioned about many times. I mean, look at the world today and think of churches. Do you know of any churches other than very fundamentalist, conservative churches of Christ that predominantly teach that autonomy is necessary, that each congregation stands as a unit unto itself and is not tied to a larger organization? Do you? I don't care what organization you talk about, almost any of them, and there are very few exceptions to that rule, almost none. Almost none. All have a greater, larger organization. What's the argument about that? Well, what do people say? Why do they not listen to what God said? Well, what did God say? Well, here's what God said. When Paul was preaching, and he went back to visit the churches that he had established on the first missionary journey, and he goes back to them to set things in order, he ordained elders in every church. And he prayed with fasted and commanded them in the Lord in whom they believed. Now, exactly where did these elders have authority? Well, in 1 Peter chapter 5, first 3 verses, he tells you where elders have authority. The elders which are among you, I exhort, who am also an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that he should be revealed. Now think about what he said, the elders which are among you. What did he then say? Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, not willingly, not filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. But then he said something else that's really important. I mean, why do you want to be an elder in the Lord's church anyway? Or is it like doctrine? It's because you love to have preeminence. You want to push yourself out in front. Well, if that's true, really, most people with huge egos are not going to be satisfied to be an elder in a local congregation that has 30 members. So how do you satisfy that ego? How do you go beyond that? Well, see, Peter warned us that what we have to be careful of is that we're not lords over God's heritage. We're to be people who are simply humble men who are in a setting of a local congregation to oversee that work. But the problem that you have is this. Here's what men argue. Men argue that this hinders the impact the church can make on the world. In other words, their idea is that this local congregation, we talked about this morning things we had to do. So what were we doing? Supporting 2 preachers in other places. Somebody said, that doesn't amount to much. Doesn't amount to much. That if we would band ourselves together and have a larger organization, then we could do more work. That's really not true. What it would mean is, well, let me ask you this question. If you have a larger organization, just consider this, just to get the point across. In the United States today, if there is a major charitable organization like Cancer Society or whatever, do you realize that it is considered to be very successful if 1/4 of all contributions go to the work that's involved? Why? Because the larger the organization, the more it takes to grease the wheel. That's why. Whereas you look at some organizations like Toys for Tots that really have no real organization at all, and pretty much everything goes to it, they contribute. Why? Because they don't have these people at the top who are drawing enormous salaries. So sometimes when you think about that, you kind of need to realize it when people make that kind of argument. Well, this local, we still, whether we're a part of this congregation ourselves or we join a larger organization, we still have a contribution last week. And that will not change, despite whether there's a national organization or whether it's just us. That doesn't change. That's not going to change. And it still takes so much to take care of the building and all the local affairs. And so we have so much to do, so much to spend. So everybody that argues that we can make a greater impact, now we can make a greater impact as more publicity. That we can do. Because after all, has there ever been a situation where a reporter from Channel 5 News, Channel 4 News, Channel 2 News, Channel 17 News came down from Nashville to interview us about the great work that we're doing? No. But if you look at huge organizations, do they do it there? Yeah. So if that's the impact you're talking about, getting more notoriety among men, yeah, I guess you might say, oh, it would do that. But when you think about it, the argument is, we can't make much of an impact individually, so we have to have a worldwide organization, a worldwide leadership position. I mean, just think of the number of stories that you saw if you watch the news in the last month about the Pope. He is the most recognized worldwide religious leaders among those who claim to believe in Christ. Makes a big impact. And that's what people are looking for. That's what they want. They want people to notice you. They want to know you're here. Well, think about this a little bit and consider it. Human wisdom and spiritual wisdom, 2 different things. We talked about that this morning. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14, you have that contrast drawn. Now, it says, the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God. Human beings, when they look at things that are stated in Scripture, sometimes look at them as being foolish. The Scriptures unquestionably state that each congregation is autonomous and has elders that oversee that work and no other. There's not any doubt about that. But people think that's not a very good plan of action, and we can improve on that and we can do something else. And that's what they're really saying. Well, what do they look at you at? When people of the world look at you and you say, where you attend services, and you tell them the number of it, if you were to go into details about what the contribution was and what the work was, you know what they look at you as? You just don't amount to much. That'd be their idea. It's foolishness to them. They think you're wasting your time. That there's no real purpose involved. But I want you to think about something. I want you to go back with me a moment, and I want you to read in Matthew chapter 20. Now, this is Jesus speaking. Now, folks want to argue with Jesus, I'll leave them to argue with him. But let's think about what happened here. James and John came to Jesus in verse 20 with their mother. Actually says, then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children, so I don't know exactly who was the leader of this big operation. But anyway, the three of them came, and they desired a certain thing of him. You know, this is one of those things that reminds you of things you've seen on movies where somebody walks in and said, would you do anything for me? You love me so much. Would you do anything? Well, I don't know. I don't know what the question is yet. That's kind of this kind of question. Look at it, Jesus. You know, we want to make a request of you. And so Jesus says, what wilt thou? What is it you want? And she saith unto him, grant that these, my two sons, may sit, the one on thy right hand and the other on thy left, on the left in thy kingdom. We're going to have a worldwide kingdom, and I want my sons to be the most important people in this kingdom. Sounds a lot like what's happened with the Catholic Church, doesn't it? But anyway, you look at that and you think about it. And you think about what transpires here. Jesus then answered and said, you know not what you ask. He said, are you able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of? And to be baptized with baptism that I am to be baptized with? And they say to him, we're able. You know, sometimes sticking your foot in your mouth when you say things that you don't really understand is not a good idea. Jesus talking about his crucifixion, his death, and all the terrible mistreatment that were going along with it. And he goes on to say, you shall drink indeed of my cup. You'll suffer some punishment. Be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. And the only apostle that avoided martyrdom was John. But, he said, to sit on my right hand, on my left is not mine to give. And when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren. And Jesus called them unto him and said, notice the statement he made. Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. And it shall not be so among you. But whosoever be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. We need to be really careful when we start saying, you know, the plan God has, it's all right, but, you know, it might have done well in the first century, but we don't live in the first century. We live in the 21st century, and if we want to make any real impact on the world, we're going to have to join ourselves into some kind of a worldwide organization. We can't just be a little nothing small country congregation because we don't amount to anything and we want to rise above that. But look back at what he said here and kind of compare the thought processes. Do you think that man's plan is better than God's? That's really the question. The other has to do with music and worship because it's the other one that this sometimes comes up. I mean, when people... just think about it. If you're listening to music on the radio for entertainment, you might see some people who listen to a cappella music, but they're not many. Most everybody has some musical instrument they really appreciate. I think the one that I appreciate the most would be the mandolin. I watch that thing and I see people who can really play it, and it just really thrills me when I see them play it. It has a certain quality about it. So I understand that we, from a human perspective, kind of really look to that as being, oh, that's just great. But the problem we have is this. Historically. Now, this is a question that there's absolutely positively no way you can get around the church that was established by the apostles in the first century existed for 800 years before it began to use instruments of music in worship. Now, that's a fact that can't be denied. You can read any biblical encyclopedia and historical record you want to, and that's the truth. Why? Why was that true? Is it because they didn't have them? Well, you can read Psalms 150 and find that in the Old Testament they had instruments of music. They could have had them anytime they wished. The reason that was true was because God stated in Ephesians chapter 5 and other places, there are 9 passages in the New Testament that talk about music. Only going to look at one. Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing. And singing has a very distinctive definition. And making melody in your heart to the Lord. And that's what he said. That's the truth. And yet, you do realize that when it began to be introduced, particularly into the Lord's church in the 1800s, the argument that was used is, our singing is really bad, and if we had a piano, it'll kind of keep us all together and we'll do a better job. Maybe so. I don't even argue that might be true. We might stay on pitch a little better, and it might make it more enjoyable for us to listen to if we really like instruments of music. It might have. I don't argue that. That's not my argument. But my argument is, would it be an improvement? Would it be an improvement? Let's think about it. If we changed to instruments, and it was made to improve our singing, without any question, and to make it more pleasing to listen to, the question is, in whose eyes? You know, there's a statement that has been made hundreds of times. And it is, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One thing I really get a kick out of is watching Food Network shows when they go in and they look at restaurants and they give you their opinion of the food. Pat and I went to a place one time that had caviar on the salad bar. And I didn't try it. It didn't look too good to me. It looked like a bunch of little black marbles. But she did. And she said it's the worst thing she ever tasted. But those people that would kill for the stuff love it. I mean, you've got to realize that when you're talking about pleasing someone, that everyone has different taste. So if you're going to improve something, and you're going to improve it by adding the musical instruments, who are you trying to impress? Who is it that you really are improving it for? The Apostle Paul, in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 8, said this to the Galatians. But though we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel to you than that which we have received, let him be accursed. And remember, worship of the church and instrumental music and a cappella music was a part of that gospel. And then he asked the pertinent question that gets right to the point. Do I now persuade men or God? A bunch of Coca-Cola executives back many years ago decided that they would have a new, improved version of Coke. I'm not sure that in the history of commerce in the United States there's been a bigger flop than that one. You remember it? You remember what an outcry there was? And people threw a fit? And so they then brought out the two, and you could get the new Coke and the old Coke side by side, but then eventually, I don't even know if they even make a new Coke anymore. I don't know. I think it finally just disappeared. Evidently, some top executive in Coke tasted that and said, man, this is great. And the people in the United States tasted and said, this is garbage. We don't want it. So when you start thinking about pleasing, who are you pleasing? And that's why he says, do I now persuade men or God? When the people of Israel came across the river and built this altar, do you think it would have been more pleasing to them if God would have allowed them to take their instruments and carved it and made it into some kind of design that was intricate and did all this? Do you think that would have made them happier? Probably so. But who are they pleasing? wasn't pleasing themselves, they were pleasing God. When we worship, who are we pleasing? Do I seek to please men? If I yet please men, I'd not be the servant of Christ. I certify you, brethren, the gospel which is preached to me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Have you ever heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church and hated it? And profiting the Jews' religion above many equals mine own country, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. So he goes on to tell them, you know, I got this from Jesus Christ. I didn't get it from man. And from my personal perspective, I was really happy being a Jew. And it took a whole lot of doing to convert me and change me from that position. That's what he's saying. So you stop and you think, and you realize, when people say to you, you could really improve your singing by adding a piano. Maybe so. In my case, maybe adding a mandolin might be better than a piano. I'm not real impressed with piano playing, although I've heard some I really like. But the mandolin might do more for me. But it probably wouldn't for some of you. Some folks probably hate mandolin music, don't like it at all. I don't know. But the question is, who are we trying to please? Who would it improve it for? If God said sing can make melody in your hearts, and you're worshiping Him and you're addressing your praise to Him, who is it that you're trying to impress? Now, in matters concerning the church, is man in a position to improve it? I mean, are we in a position? Now, we may improve detergent, and sometimes we do. There are products today that are so much better than they were in time past that it's ridiculous, that we've improved tremendously. That's true. But we're not talking about products here. We're talking about a relationship with God and whether it's pleasing in His sight or whether it's not. Are we in a position to improve that? You know, the church was designed by God to glorify Him, to worship Him, and to do His work. Now think about it. Him, Him, Him. Him, Him, His, I guess I should say. I started including this, but it was going to be too long and just take so much time I couldn't. But I'm going to encourage you to do something sometime that might really kind of open your eyes. You know, in the book of Job, there's a part of it that we don't read a lot. And one part we really read very little are the words of this final friend of Job named Elihu. I only knew one other man in my life named Elihu. Really liked him. Don't know about this Elihu, but I like that one. But this Elihu is the one person we don't read a lot about, but he had a pretty long speech. Do you know what the most used word when I began to read his speech was? The most used word that Elihu would use is I. You know what he even said? All you people have spoken. Now I'm going to give you my opinion. I and my were the two most used words that he used in his speech. And it's kind of representative of man. It's kind of the way religious leaders are today. They tell you all about what I want, what my preference is. Now let's ask a question. What does God want? What's His preference? Well, I don't care. I want what I want, and I want what my preference is. But I want to tell you something that's interesting. We often talk about Job's discussion with God, which began in chapter 38. We've read that a lot of times. I'm not going to read that tonight. And it's interesting to me that in chapter 38 that the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, and you know what's really interesting? All right, that was in chapter 38. If you went back, 37, 36, 35, 34, when you look back to all those, 33, even back to chapter 32, there are 6 chapters that Elihu tells you all about what I think. And when God got ready to deal with it, do you know what he did with Elihu's remarks? Nothing. Totally ignored them. Didn't even mention them. It's as if he didn't speak. Because at the end of chapter 31, Job ends his speech. And then in chapter 38, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. It was as if Elihu didn't say a word. God didn't even address it, period. He went back to Job. But what did he say to Job? Well, in chapter 40, he concluded his comments to Job. Actually, chapter 40 and 41, both are his concluding comments. But chapter 40, there's 14 verses here. And I want to ask you the question, is in matters, spiritual matters, is man in a position to improve on what God has said? I want you to read what God said to Job. We usually read a couple of verses. We're going to read 14. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, now, this is a straightforward statement. Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? Can a person go to God and say, your plan is faulty and here are the ways to improve it? That's what he said. He that reproveth God, let him answer. And you know what Job's answer was? Job's answer to the Lord was this, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. And then the Lord turned to Job and made a number of statements through verse 14. It's made more than that, but through verse 14 is where we want to read through. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me. Will thou also disannul my judgment? Are you going to question me and tell me that you could improve, Lord? That this situation could be better than you made it? That what you said, I don't believe is as good as it could be. There could be better. That's what he's asking. That's what God says to Job. He goes on to say, wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me? That thou mayest be righteous. Now you think about this. Listen to all the things you hear people say today about improvements that need to be made in the will of God, and consider what he said. Hast thou an arm like God? Canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, bind their faces in secret. Then will I also confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. You listen very carefully to what he said. God said to Job, now really, you think that you are in a position to question my judgment, to condemn my actions, because you're more righteous and more powerful than me. That's what man does. Do you realize that whenever a person comes along and says, well, yeah, I know that's what the scriptures say, but you know what? I really believe that this would be better. Can you just think of that? Just give that some consideration. Now, I may question a lot of people. And you may say something, I say, I don't know, I don't agree with that. I think it could be better. We can do it this way or that way. We may get an argument about it. And you know, there's no saying about that everybody has an opinion. And your opinion's worth about the same as mine. And that's true too. But if I put my opinion alongside the will of God, then my opinion has no value. And that really is what we need to understand. People who claim to believe the Bible to be the inspired will of God need to realize that there's no improving. It is what it is. It was given by God. And there's no way that we mortal men can improve that. We just can't. And we need to understand it. I don't care what we're talking about. Pick those two things because I hear those statements made. Oh, the church as a local congregation under the leadership of its elders is just a useless organization. Worldwide movement, that's a much improved product. And music, sometimes it's horrible. Just add the piano and it'll make it better. Two arguments that I've heard a lot. And I think men need to consider what they really say. Who are you pleasing anyway? Who makes a decision about what's better and what's not? People say to me all the time, they'll look at the house we're building and they'll say, do you like that house? I really don't like that. I always have the same remark. It does not matter whether I like the house or I don't like the house. That's not important. I don't write the checks, and therefore it's not mine. And so my opinion has no relevance here. And when you get to spiritual things, your opinion has no relevance there. It's God's will. It's God's church. And therefore, it's God that we have to please. And people need to understand that. They're knowing you and improve. And human wisdom destroys, doesn't improve things of the spiritual nature. Think about it. As a person who's not a Christian, you need to obey the gospel. People today constantly talk about how faulty it is to say that you have to repent and be baptized to be saved. Why is that faulty? God said so. Who are we to say, well, that's a bad plan? That demands something that demonstrates that we deserve salvation. That's the argument you hear. My wisdom and God's wisdom are not the same. And I'll just leave things in His hands like Naaman should have done and say, okay, that's what God said, that's what we're going to do. Because that cannot be improved upon. Think about it together. We stand as we sing.